Hi, you're on the channel Nomad of Dreams. Today, I'll talk about the philosophy of Zarathustra and about how its ideas propose a program for rethinking the human. I'll explain the key thoughts of the text, "Thus spoke Zarathustra," as a set of practices for the creativity of life and the will. This will be a calm, clear analysis so that you get a sense of why these ideas live on and what can be done with them. Where are you listening from and what time is it there now? Write in the comments. I really enjoy seeing the geography and the hours of listeners. Take a deep breath, roll your shoulders back, and even out your breathing rhythm so the voice inside you becomes more attentive. Zarathustra speaks as a thinker who sets the task of a radical revaluation of meanings. His type of thinking is normative philosophy, ideas about which values are worth creating and how to live according to them. The thinking remains relevant because it addresses universal questions of human existence: meaning, power, suffering, creativity, and offers practical guidelines for overcoming them. One of the central images through which all this condenses into a program for life is the figure of the Overman. I will rely on the following supports so the map becomes clear. Revelation as a norm, the overhuman goal as a creative task, the death of external supports and the freedom and risk associated with it, the eternal return as an ethical test, the revaluation of values as a revolution of meaning, an ethos of self-overcoming, the will to power as the driving force of life, a critique of pity as a demotivating force, a critique of herd morality and the danger of mass comfort, the image of the lost man as a diagnosis of cultural decline, the practice of amor fati, love of fate, and the idea of truth as an act of creation. These supports will sound as working tools, not abstractions. Each point is an occasion to think about how to live and what to evaluate as valuable. The Overman is the goal of human self-production and the creativity of values. This image sets the scale. Man is regarded as the artist of his own character and fate, as the creator of new orientations for life. What matters is not an external model, but the activity of creating forms of life. Constant self-improvement, selection of habits, cultivation of the will, and taste. Self-overcoming becomes an ethical practice in which every overcoming is a step toward a different quality of being. Clarification: the Overman is not an ideal endpoint, but a process. The goal functions as a guiding ideal that stimulates the transformation of oneself through trials and choice. The will to power here is understood as life motion, as the striving to amplify the force of one's creative acts, to evaluate actions by their capacity to increase vital power. The creation of values includes an aesthetic assessment of actions and ways of life, where beauty determines not outward form, but inner strength. The boundary of this idea is responsibility. Creating new meanings requires readiness to bear consequences and to acknowledge the cost of autonomy of meaning. Moral independence is accompanied by a moral burden. Formal freedom implies the obligation to answer for the worlds a person constructs. It is precisely this cost that makes the proposal serious. The philosophy offers not relief from weight, but its transformation into a resource for creativity. The connection with the philosophy of Zarathustra is clear in that the image of the Overman functions as a cultivation of the will and the aesthetics of life. The idea becomes pedagogical. The thought calls for awakening inner strength, for discipline of taste, and for radical care of one's own form of existence. These attitudes will be developed further through other supports, but for now, it is enough to hold the image of a person who purposefully creates values and is ready to pay for this with personal responsibility. The Overman is not simply a dream of perfection. It is a practical task of restructuring the relation to oneself and to values. The goal is that a person becomes the artist of their own character, deliberately selects habits, chooses tastes, and shapes rhythms of life so that they enhance their creative power and responsibility. Explanation requires looking at the procedures that make this task feasible. It is about discipline of the will, about constant testing of desires for their productivity, about taste as a selector of actions. The will to power manifests here as a criterion of evaluation, not power over others, but the ability to multiply one's creative energy and to create forms of life in which that energy can develop.
Aesthetic solves practical questions. What is worth the effort? Which sufferings to turn into material for growth? Which rituals consolidate a new habit? Forming oneself also presupposes the art of renouncing comfortable excuses and the ability to endure emptiness while a new meaning is created.
Short conclusion. This is a program of action, not a verbal ideal. You receive a set of orientations for training the will, evaluating actions, and aesthetically educating everyday life. What matters here is the sequence of small decisions, repeated until they become part of a form of life. The limits of this program are visible in its vulnerability and cost. Any creation of values requires readiness to bear their consequences, to accept mistakes, and to answer for what you have elevated to a norm. Self-creation intensifies loneliness because new meanings rarely immediately find broad support. Revaluation requires dialogue with reality, and endless play with ideals can turn into aesthetic caprice without connection to the practice of responsibility. As a criterion remains the ability to endure and process suffering, not its denial. It is through this that the strength of the proposed forms of life manifests. Zarathustra shows the way as a pedagogy of radical cultivation of the will and taste. In the text, this image serves not to venerate personality, but as a teaching method, to awaken the urge for self-creation, to confront with trials, and to demand an account before one's own ideal. Friedrich Nietzsche, through the voice of Zarathustra, introduces the idea not as dogma, but as a task to be carried out in life. Therefore, the Overman for him always remains a measure and an exam that you apply to yourself every day.
I can continue, but to guarantee exactly 4,000 characters, including spaces, I need to clarify. Should line breaks be counted as characters? And do you need the punctuation/spaces at the end of the current text to be preserved exactly? I can either continue right now and try to guess the length, risk of deviation, or check and precisely count characters, adding text step by step until I reach 4,000. A bit longer, but exact. Which option do you prefer? The death of God as a diagnosis states the problem in a clear voice. The former, supports that gave meaning and prepared moral answers to hardships, have ceased to perform that function. Friedrich Nietzsche formulated this not as a theoretical fact, but as a historical churn that exposes people to the necessity of justifying their values and goals themselves. The consequences of such exposure are not a worrying hypothesis, but a practical task: to live in a world where an external guarantee is lost and no longer substitutes for personal responsibility for meaning. The criterion by which one should judge the reaction to this state is simple and strict. The creation of values should be tested by their ability to sustain life for the individual and society. Sustain makes sense in two dimensions: to withstand the test of suffering and to give energy for creativity. Friedrich Nietzsche insisted that the criterion of a value's truth lies in its viability, in how much it multiplies the strength of the will and brings the capacity to act. A brief formula sounds like the requirement of responsibility for choice.
If you have made a value your canvas, are you ready to bear the imprint of its consequences on yourself? The consequences of the destruction of old foundations take shape in concrete forms of behavior and feeling. Liberation combines with bewilderment. Freedom implies the chance to create and simultaneously the risk of meaninglessness. Political and personal projects get a field of experiments where every innovation is tested for the toughness of life, not only for logic. Some projects die out quickly, others pass through suffering and establish themselves as new habits of existence. As a short illustrative image, a city festival without a former sacred center is easily replaced by a base of consumption and celebration of transaction, until there are people ready to impart another meaning to the celebration and endure the cost of organizing it. Such a switch shows that the appearance of alternatives does not guarantee their significance. Significance becomes a function of choice and endurance. There are also sharper consequences: mass apathy, alienation from common goals, growth of those forms of collective spectacle that offer easy answers instead of the labor of creating values. Religious and cultural dust sometimes becomes a convenient medium for ideologies promising to restore order without personal responsibility. At the same time, a space opens for artists, thinkers, and ordinary people ready to experiment with forms of life and willing to accept the consequences of their decisions. Friedrich Nietzsche saw in this field both a challenge and a chance. A challenge in that many prefer carelessness, and a chance in that an opportunity emerges for genuine rethinking. The boundary in this picture is clear. Arbitrary invention of meanings does not free one from the fact of their testing by life. Values that prove barren when confronted with suffering and necessity are doomed to degeneration and spiritual poverty. Responsibility for creating meaning includes readiness to be accountable for one's action and the ability to accept loss if the choice turns out to be wrong. Friedrich Nietzsche set this limit as the moral price of autonomy. Freedom brings responsibility, and renouncing it is impossible without forfeiting human dignity. You stand before the same question that the era after the disappearance of FOMO supports poses. Test your system of values in hard practice. Does it withstand pain? Does it give the power to act? Does it generate new forms of life that will hold up under pressure of circumstances? If the answers are affirmative, your meanings have weight. If not, it is worth returning to work on them, accepting that creating values is a craft that requires effort, patience, and honesty. Friedrich Nietzsche offers not an escape from responsibility, but its acceptance as a key moral position in a world where external guarantees no longer exist. The revaluation of all values works as a technical procedure consisting of sequential operations. First, there is the marking of the heritage. You record which norms and images determine behavior, emotions, and goals. Next follows a genealogical analysis. One looks for the sources of these norms, their origin, and the interests they serve. Then comes the test of viability. The value is checked for its ability to preserve or multiply the strength of the will, to withstand suffering, and to give an impulse for creativity. If a value passes the test, it is formally reintegrated into practices, rituals, and language. If it fails, transmutation begins. The creation of new formulations, new habits, and aesthetic criteria that take on the role of the old norm. This whole algorithm requires discipline, constant testing in actions, clear evaluation criteria, and readiness for long work on consolidating new meanings. Friedrich Nietzsche proposes such a procedure as a technique of the spirit, not as an episodic reaction. Why this procedure is needed is clear from the situation you find yourself in.
The loss of former supports leaves a space where old words mean little and new meanings do not arise by themselves. Revaluation creates an instrument that allows you to turn emptiness into a field of creative activity. It is needed to renew the capacity for self-governance and to give people orientations that make life stronger and richer. Without targeted work on values, mass habits and inertia cement small pleasures and fears as standards of behavior, and culture degrades into a set of mechanical reactions. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this task not for theorists, but for those who are ready to take on the labor of creating a form of life capable of withstanding the test of time and suffering. Where the mechanism breaks down and why this is dangerous. The reason for failure is most often not in the method, but in the motivation and conditions of application. If revaluation is carried out of revenge, envy, or a desire for power, the process turns into a verbal renovation that preserves the same dominance under a new label. Such a failure manifests in the rapid gluing together of new slogans, without testing by practice, in the absence of rituals that consolidate habits, and in ignoring the criterion of viability. The consequences are predictable. Formal values are created that unintentionally serve the interests of the powerful. The social climate fills with rigidity and violence, and spiritual energy dissipates in verbal conflicts. Another path of breakdown is excessive abstractness of revaluation, when analysis remains on the level of speculation and does not lead to changes in deeds and bodily habits. Friedrich Nietzsche emphasized the price of practice. The absence of bodily and aesthetic consolidation makes any reform ephemeral. Finally, the large-scale risk is that mass implementation of revaluation without institutional and cultural support creates a vacuum that is filled with foreign ideologies, or banal conformism under a new brand. The conclusion is simple and practical. The revaluation of all values is a craft, not a ritual of instant freedom. It requires a clear methodology, moral honesty, and long work on forms of life. New values must be brought out through testing of the strength of will, through the pain and joy of creation, through the aesthetics of actions and stable practices. If you take on this task, keep three things in view: the source of your motives, the criteria of viability, and the paths of institutional consolidation of changes. Friedrich Nietzsche proposed courage, on the condition that courage become a discipline, not a whim. Revaluation justifies itself only where it increases the ability to live and create. Otherwise it remains words that will quickly turn into an empty fashion and turn against those who proclaimed it. Friedrich Nietzsche returns us to responsibility. Being a creator of values means preparing the soil and bearing its fruits, along with the risk. Friedrich Nietzsche reminds that the price of freedom of meanings is work, and that price is within the power only of those ready to invest in life again and again. Why make life an eternal training of oneself rather than a one-time achievement of a goal? Self-overcoming in Friedrich Nietzsche appears as a constant process that shapes character through struggle with comfort, habit, and one's own weakness. It is not a list of qualities for an achievement gallery, but a behavioral school: habits, rituals, small exams, and returns to oneself. Friedrich Nietzsche proposed to perceive life as a workshop where a person day by day brings their character to ever finer form. Such an image makes self-overcoming an engaging craft that requires both aesthetic sensitivity and discipline. It is important to think about methods and about which practices conserve energy and which dissipate it. How this unfolds in practice. The first rule: a constant challenge to one's limits through what is available right now. Sleep and eating habits, control of speech,
efforts in work and art. The second element, reflection on the results of efforts, an honest account of what brought growth and what only fatigue. The third moment, turning defeats into material for self-creation, when failure serves as a laboratory sample rather than an excuse. Such an order turns struggle into a series of small operations that compose character. Friedrich Nietzsche saw a moral duty here, not to be satisfied with who you have become, but to strive for a shape that is not yet formed. Development of this idea, through practice and examples. Small daily exercises of the will are more important than loud decisions. Someone began to get up an hour earlier and every day did extra work on their craft. After a year, the habit changed their choices and circle of acquaintances.
I have seen how regular refusal of comfort restructures the emotional scale. Patience becomes more resilient, ambitions more exacting. Self-overcoming requires accounting for motives and the structure of the process. The reason for motivation determines the direction of efforts, the structure, the sequential habits, and the consequences are seen in increased ability to bear difficulties and create the new. At the same time, one must remember the limits of the method. Constant struggle can exhaust resources without aesthetics and meaning, so every effort should be confirmed by a feeling of growth, not merely duty. The boundary of this strategy is clear and concrete. Self-overcoming becomes toxic when honesty before oneself is lost, and the ability to say why a particular effort is being made disappears. Friedrich Nietzsche emphasizes that struggle without purpose turns into depletion of the will. The second boundary, the social cost. Constant growth sometimes requires solitude and refusal of familiar mass roles, and this should be accepted consciously. The third boundary, the aesthetic. Effort must have form, otherwise it does not integrate into life and remains only duty. Ultimately, self-overcoming is a lifelong craft, requiring clear practices, honest accounting, and taste for form. If you are ready to invest every day, if you can turn pain into a lesson and keep attention on true motives, then self-overcoming becomes a transforming power. Friedrich Nietzsche offered not a distant ideal, but a path measured by small victories over habit and over oneself. Finally, it is important to maintain a sense of proportion and culture in self-overcoming.
If one accepts this stance, morality ceases to be a set of prohibitions. It becomes a toolkit for assessing which forms of action give a person more power for further creativity and self-formation. Friedrich Nietzsche sees in this not a metaphor, but a key analytical support. Values are rooted in the movement of vital energy. Clarification is important because the word power, in ordinary understanding, is loaded with politics and violence. The will to power is above all the ability to give form, to build order, to assert tastes and meanings. It manifests in the aesthetics of choice, in the discipline of habits, in the ability to set a goal and change it along the way. This energy acts like an artist who does not merely dominate the canvas, but produces new proportions and rhythms of being. It measures the quality of life not by the level of comfort, but by the strength of creative output. Friedrich Nietzsche appears here as a provocateur of thought, pointing out that the assessment of a person's strength is an assessment of his ability to create values. The tie to the practice of your life is to learn to read through your own motives and coordinates. Try to discern where the impulse comes from, to amplify your creative energy itself or for external recognition. Emphasize forming criteria that measure the growth of your capacity to act and create meanings, not merely the accumulation of results. Take responsibility for the values you introduce into your surroundings, because every accepted value becomes a mechanism that increases or decreases your power. Friedrich Nietzsche suggests treating this consciously. Work with the will to power as material for self-creation, and then efforts will become the instrument of artistically creating your own life.
However, it should be noted, the will to power does not give a carte blanche for arbitrariness. An important condition is developing sensitivity to the boundaries of others, because a steady creative energy requires a stable field of relations, not its destruction. Power without measure leads to emptiness. Its true manifestation is in the artistic transformation of the world, not in petty tyranny. Thus Nietzsche speaks of the Übermensch not as a ruler over others, but as one who has overcome his own weakness and grown new values within himself. Practically, this means two things. First, learn to test your values. Subject them to the experiment of life. Observe how they affect your energy and abilities. If a certain habit exhausts you, it should be transformed or let go. If it strengthens you, cultivate it. Second, preserve the aesthetic seriousness of your actions. Every goal, every effort should be thought out as a stroke in the larger picture of your life. This is how a discipline is formed that does not humiliate freedom, but multiplies it. Ultimately, accepting the will to power means accepting responsibility for your becoming and for the culture you create around yourself. It is a hard path, but it grants the joy of co-creation, to see how your energy gives shape and meaning, and to see in that your own greatness, not as superiority over others, but as a contribution. You take on the creation of a new measure for your actions. You formulate a rule that once seemed foreign, introduce a ritual, change the language of praise and condemnation in your circle. With this act begins not only freedom, but also obligation. Responsibility manifests in the fact that the consequences of your norms become part of other people's lives, and the scope of further action depends on their strength and direction. Friedrich Nietzsche described this as the price of autonomy. The meaning you forge requires payment in hands and time, not only inspiration. The implication of this particular case is simple and harsh. The creation of a new value inevitably returns to its creator in the form of a demand for justification, correction, and acceptance of consequences. You are responsible for how your norm changes the habits, relationships, and possibilities of others. This responsibility does not grant abstract freedom.
It gives it the pressure that shapes the character of your self-creation. What it means exactly to take on such responsibility? The reason is that a value does not exist in a vacuum. To live, it must be expressed in behavior, institutions, and language. The arrangement of this process includes several layers. First, the idea passes through practices, habits, words, rituals, and begins to affect reality. Next, the support mechanism requires attentional resources, constant repetition, rules of application, and criticism. Consequences consist of expected and unexpected effects. Abandoning control over the implemented norm turns into its distortion or harm. Friedrich Nietzsche shows that creative will always entails risk and the task of tending the fruits of one's creation. It is precisely the willingness to endure and correct that risk that distinguishes a responsible creator from one who throws ideas into the world like fireworks. To generalize, one can say this: to be a creator of values means at once to be author of the content and steward of its dissemination. This dual role requires skills in forming meaning and discipline toward its consequences. Clarity in motives, honesty in assessing effects, and the ability to change implementation techniques. All these are practical skills that make self-affirmation morally robust. Friedrich Nietzsche emphasizes that the greatness of the creator lies not only in creating new rules, but also in not rejecting the price that these rules impose on life and social bonds. The limitation of this responsibility is expressed in the bounds of permissible intervention and in the ability not to turn creativity into tyranny. Limits are set by a conscious assessment of harm and usefulness, the ability to listen to consequences, and the readiness to correct course. If you take on the status of legislator of meaning, be prepared not only to assert, but also to answer for the reckoning when intentions and effects diverge. Friedrich Nietzsche suggests perceiving this payment as part of the path. If meaning is autonomous, its creator is obliged to bear the fruits he demanded of the world. In this requirement lies the moral price of autonomy, a price without which the creation of values remains an empty gesture. This means changing the mindset and dialogue, introducing procedures of evaluation, and staying ready for corrections. True responsibility manifests in the ability to sustain discussion, listen to opposing points, and acknowledge when revision is required. Creating an institution without a mechanism for correction turns into a frozen tradition. An idea close to criticism loses life. Therefore, it is important for the creator to design feedback, transparent rules, access to review, and a culture where mistakes are considered data for improvement, not a verdict. To be an author of values means to combine passion and caution. This does not cancel boldness. On the contrary, boldness is needed for the beginning, and caution for continuation. The more carefully you build in mechanisms of care, the more easily the world accepts the proposed meanings, and the smaller the payment you will have to make in the form of destruction of ties. This is the payment that makes meaning durable, not destruction, but the careful accompaniment of its life in the world. Exactly that. The rule is clear. Keep your valuation to yourself and check it before accepting someone else's. This is a demand for discipline of the spirit, a habit of pausing when the majority's voice sounds like the only possible way. Friedrich Nietzsche insisted that the moral ornament of society is often imposed by silent agreement, not by a reasoned choice. Your task is not to neglect your own criterion in favor of the comfort of conformity. Why this becomes a problem? One reason is that humans are designed to economize effort. Repeating someone else's assessment saves energy and reduces the risk of social isolation. The structure of this mechanism includes mimicked behavior, rituals of confirmation, and the language of averaged praise. The consequences are simple and deep. Diversity of initiatives decreases. The risk of radical honesty diminishes. Inertia of habits grows. Friedrich Nietzsche saw that such rooting leads to a flattening of the moral space, where values lose creative tension and become convenient cliches. The action of this phenomenon shows itself in details. Default voting chooses the path of least resistance. A quick joke about the right opinion closes the question, and the rare thought remains unsupported.
In a group where important decisions are made by consensus, caution often wins, and a bold idea dies from the banal, waiting for approval. These mechanisms work unnoticed, but leave a trace. An environment forms that encourages mediocrity as the norm. What to do about it? First, develop the practice of delaying consent. Put a pause between agreement and action. Demand that those who propose a common line formulate their reasons. Second, introduce the habit of argumentation. Ask to explain the values behind the decision and make sure words do not replace deeds. Third, train the role of a necessary dissenter at least occasionally. This is not an imitation of conflict, but a discipline to test the strength of foundations. Fourth, evaluate through aesthetics, not only through utility. Ask yourself what qualities of life the proposed mode of action supports. These practices reduce the chance of your judgment being absorbed by herd logic. The solution is not to try to flee people forever or to build a stall-like individuality. The solution is to enliven your responsibility for values as a skill. Nietzsche demanded a solidarity of solitude, to remain solitary in thought, even in the company of close ones. This is achieved through small rituals of verification, through the ability to endure social discomfort for the sake of honest assessment. If you learn to hold your measure and at the same time explain it to the world so that it can be tested, herd power will lose its hold on you. This is the path to the freedom Nietzsche spoke of. Freedom to think and create values that withstand the test of communication, not dissolve in the convenience of the crowd. Think for yourself, don't follow 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 the crowd. Think for yourself,
don't follow the crowd. Think for yourself, don't follow the crowd. Think for yourself, don't follow the crowd. There is an image of a person who strives for calm, for the complete absence of risk, for even comfort. And, on the contrary, an image of one who seeks heights, pain, and meaning in trials. The first image bears the name given by Friedrich Nietzsche, the last man. He is not a hero, not a villain, but the outcome of a culture where the aim of life is reduced to minimizing discomfort and maximizing habitual pleasure. The last man lives by the standards of safety. His morning is similar to his evening. Dialogue equals silence. Desires fit into standard formulas of consumption. The internal criterion is reduced to what is pleasant right now. This is not so much a lack of willpower as a change of priorities. Greatness is replaced by stability, risk by predictability, longing for meaning by habitual feeling of time. Friedrich Nietzsche described this phenomenon as cultural degradation, arising where the pursuit of comfort became a moral guide. The mechanism is simple and slow. A culture that rewards passivity strengthens the tools of passivity. Education and entertainment are restructured to meet the expectation of minimal tension. The economy shapes products for these expectations. Social practices encourage avoidance of conflict. The consequence is a loss of scale. Demands for the authenticity of actions disappear. Tasks requiring spiritual tension vanish. Nietzsche believed that then the surfeit of safety displaces the great striving, and man stops loving his fate enough to create it. Within the person, this manifests as an inability to take honest risks. One who gets used to all even loses the taste for renewing himself. Vanity replaces an honest challenge, and habitual pleasures become the measure of a full life. Socially, this type reduces the ambitions of society. Standards drop, creativity becomes anecdotal, and culture turns into a series of servicing rituals. Such a society has little chance of generating genuinely new forms of life and values. Why this is dangerous for you personally? If you allow yourself to be governed only by comfort, your capacities for self-overcoming weaken. Habits of comfort form circles of dependence on external stimuli, on opinions, on safe choices. A tendency grows to trust superficial authorities because they ease decision-making. Nietzsche saw in this a threat to the spiritual mobility of a person, to his ability to create himself as a project. Unfolding this thought does not mean a call to senseless suffering, but to a reassessment of measures. Evaluate a situation by a scale of magnitude. How much does a decision demand of you an expansion of soul? How much does it cause strain and thereby open the potential for transformation? The search for meaning sometimes requires enduring inconvenience and refusing short-term satisfaction in order to accumulate strength for a greater cause. I say this because I have seen how a habit of comfort gradually removes from life those points that once became sources of growth. The maxim is simple and strict. Do not agree to a life whose aim is only the absence of problems. Set before yourself demands that grab your edge and pull you upward. Control over your fate requires readiness to feel pain and to rejoice in overcoming it. Nietzsche warned against the lost man as a diagnosis of civilization. It is enough for you to remember this image, to recognize spreading indifference in time, and shift your bearings to those that will again make life a work with tension, risk, and meaning. Amor fati. The love of fate has a practical stance. To love what has happened and make from it material for creating your own life. This is not emotional acquiescence, but an active form of acceptance that turns any situation into raw material for action. Love of fate includes gratitude for what is and persistence in transforming circumstances. It changes evaluative scales. Success and failure become points of experience, not a sentence on self-esteem. For you, this means seeing loss as a source of skill and pain as training of the will. Nietzsche places this stance at the center of life philosophy, linking it with the demand to love your life so that you would wish to live it again and again. The resulting consequence is stability of values. When fate is loved, you stop fleeing from your decisions and begin to answer for their fruits. A habit forms of turning accident into meaning, and every mistake becomes a contribution to the craft of living. I observe this as a shift in attitude to the inner dialogue. Former self-pity gives way to the demand to learn and grow. Nietzsche saw in such discipline not merely a moral quality, but an aesthetic imperative of life. Consider how this manifests concretely in behavior. What gestures cultivate love of fate? Recognition of your own choice, recognition of limitations, and then energetic creative movement within these boundaries, readiness to celebrate hardships overcome. These gestures do not require external blessing. They are born in the everyday relation to yourself and to what happens around you. Working on perception habits becomes more important than searching for universal justifications. Practical steps will fall into place themselves if you agree to a few simple rules.
Take responsibility for past decisions and extract lessons from them. Set goals so that achieving them requires your growth. Turn regret into a task and routine into an exercise for heart and mind. Such practices change the tone of your inner speech and give strength to act further. Nietzsche presented this method as a path to a strength that not only defeats circumstances, but makes them part of its artistic design. The limits of this approach are clear. Love of fate requires volitional participation and does not work through passive acceptance. It is coupled with responsibility for choices and consequences. The will to love fate must be accompanied by discipline, otherwise the affirmation turns into an excuse for inaction. For your life, this means combining acceptance with constant self-education and checking of your intentions. Nietzsche ties amor fati to the demand to live so as to desire repetition. In his treatment, this is not a pretty formula, but a moral practice tested by deed. Nietzsche himself invited one to make fate material for creativity, not a burden, and on that basis formed the idea of the strong person, for whom love of one's lot is the main means of forming meaning. Take this as an exercise. Love your road and work to make it worthy of love. This does not mean ignoring suffering or justifying the cruelty of circumstances. Love of fate requires honesty. Acknowledge when you must leave destructive relationships or change your environment, and at the same time learn to extract meaning from what cannot be changed. Relationships with people become deeper when you accept their choices, without expecting them to fix your life. Amor fati is also the art of gratitude. By noticing the smallest favorable chance events, you build a reserve of resilience to blows. Start small. Each evening, note one event of the day you are grateful for, and one that can be turned into a lesson. Do this regularly, and the habit of seeing life as material for creativity will take hold. Over time, you will see. Love of fate does not make you a passive observer, but arms you with clarity, courage, and creative boldness. Live so that, looking back, you can say, "Yes, I accepted my road and made it my own." Keep it up. The modern tendency to avoid pain turns tragedy into a diagnosis. People learn to minimize blows, discard everything that wounds, and this makes life smooth, but as thin as porcelain. The problem is that the loss of the ability to accept suffering deprives you of the raw material for depth and creativity. Nietzsche insisted that tragedy connects knowledge of fragility with willpower. And when this connection is broken, a void arises that neither comfort nor security will fill. The criterion by which one determines whether suffering is creative or destructive is simple and severe. It must be integrated into life practice so as to serve as a source of form and meaning. The first marker, the ability to give the experience a language and an image, to turn pain into an act of expression. The second marker, responsibility, when the experience does not justify inaction but requires action. The third marker, feedback, when new resilience and new skills are born from pain. These three signs serve as a test. If suffering passes through them, it becomes material for creation. If not, it remains merely a wound. The consequences of such a translation of suffering into creation are deep and multi-layered. On a personal level, character is rebuilt, forming that strength which Nietzsche gave an aesthetic valuation. A painful event ceases to be only a source of grievance. It becomes an exercise in discipline and an opportunity to reorder values. In creativity, suffering provides flesh for images and directly affects the form of the work. In social life, transformed tragedy produces leaders ready to pay the price for truth and bear responsibility for the consequences. Internally, this makes a person less dependent on external guarantees because he has learned to extract meaning from his experience rather than wait for it from outside. The boundary of this approach is clear and harsh. Suffering ceases to work as a resource when it destroys the ability to choose and deprives agency. Any romanticization of pain, justification of violence, or cult of martyrdom becomes dangerous the moment the aim of transformation no longer exists. Preserving dignity and the ability to say enough in the face of destruction is the key limit. In addition, suffering used as material for creativity requires reflection and discipline. Otherwise, it turns into a justification for stagnation. Any practice that does not include responsibility for the consequences and a check on growth falls outside the bounds of constructive use of pain. There are simple signs that you are moving within this boundary. If an experience sharpens your attention, expands the range of possible actions, awakens the need to do something new, it is transformed. If an experience turns into a routine of self-blame, a habit of avoiding risk, or a way of manipulating yourself and others, it goes beyond. Friedrich Nietzsche linked the notion of tragedy to the necessity of answering for one's existence, and that answer is heard as a demand for action, not as a call for pity. Rethinking suffering as a resource requires practice. Learning to formulate, to give your experiences form, and to channel them into projects that demand development rather than into excuses. I am not suggesting that you treat pain as an end in itself, but I propose regarding it as a material that requires mastery. Friedrich Nietzsche saw in tragic experience the point where aesthetics and ethics intersect, and where a person becomes the creator of himself. Test your readiness to meet the challenge. Are you prepared to take responsibility for the fruits of your suffering and make them the basis for new strength? Truth as a creative act is organized differently from the familiar picture of correspondence with facts. The mechanism is simple in composition and complex in execution. Perception selects facts, language shapes them into an image, and the will affirms this image as a measure of meaning. Selection excludes the infinity of data. Metaphors and schemas reduce chaos.
Repeatable statements institutionalize truth. Friedrich Nietzsche showed that any thesis is born in a field of power. The one who speaks invests his evaluation of the world in words, and words then return a form for further action. Truth acts as a tool that fixes a direction of behavior and determines what will be considered valuable. Such a mechanism is needed because without it, a person loses a basis for creation. Truth as a product of the will serves as a guide for decision-making and sets a framework for transformations. It gives the possibility to purposefully create the world rather than wander in an endless multitude of data. When you formulate a claim, it becomes a project of practice, ethics, and further knowledge.
Friedrich Nietzsche connected the ability to create meaning with responsibility for one's life. Truth that does not merely claim to record becomes an instrument of freedom and creativity. Where the mechanism breaks. Breakdown occurs when the act of creation loses connection with criticism and feedback. If the selection of facts degrades into arbitrary choice, if language serves as a disguise for the will to dominate, then what is proclaimed as truth turns into power rather than guidance for action. The absence of verification leads to stagnation and false calm. Assertions are entrenched by habit or authority, not by the force of evidence. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that power not subjected to honest self-critique produces illusions that suffocate the capacity to develop. Sometimes this is clearly visible. A hypothesis proclaimed loudly and repeated by institutions begins to function as fact, even with weak empirical support. When in practice, such entrenched statements block the search for alternatives, they break the creative function of truth. A small illustration. A formulation in science, initially proposed as a risky version, over time becomes an unshakable canon and blocks new experiments. In such situations, creativity disappears, leaving a fossilized construction. The conclusion is clear and strict. The form of creative truth that Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of requires discipline of the will and honesty before the evidence. To create truths means to accept the obligation to subject them to tests, to change them as new data arrive, and not to allow the will to power to turn truth into a cover for control. You can make truth a means to increase the strength of life if you simultaneously preserve the procedure of doubt and the readiness to correct your statements. Truth in such a mode remains a living form that makes you the creator of your own world and holds you responsible for it. I can continue, but to give exactly 4,000 characters, I need to clarify a small technical point. Should I count the first character of the continuation immediately after the period in the submitted text without an additional space? Or should I add a line break / space before the start of the new paragraph? Which option do you prefer? Who are you if you accept that life can be a work of art and character both a canvas and marble at once? The question is simple and heavy. This is not about a fashionable slogan of self-improvement. It is about a constant act of choice, about the discipline of taste and attention. You stand before the possibility of consciously shaping your reactions, habits, and values in the same way an artist chooses material. And this possibility requires clarity of goals and an understanding of the cost of the process. Character as art means that the materials for work are always at hand. Habits, emotions, memory, body. The structure is formed from repetitions and refusals,
from small exercises and large decisions. Friedrich Nietzsche imagined the person who creates himself with intention and style. This is not a banal aestheticizing of life. It is systematic work on form. Every morning, every conversation, every redirected impulse becomes a stroke. Every rejected weakness, a chisel that gives the volume a face. The artist of character does not merely change masks. He forms enduring lines that withstand friction with the outside world. How this works in practice. The reason for the drive toward self-creation often arises from a sense of mismatch between who you are and who you want to be.
The mechanism includes the conscious choice of repeatable actions, the establishment of rituals, checking results, and readiness to correct. A habit introduced intentionally acts as the architect of the future. It transfers effort from the sphere of will into the sphere of automatism and frees the will for new creations. The consequences of this approach are visible in the changed appraisal of events and in the ability to keep shape under pressure. Friedrich Nietzsche emphasized that creating oneself is linked to responsibility for the consequences of those changes, for relationships, creativity, and the will to power. The boundary of this practice is clear and important. Self-creation requires honesty toward those parts of the personality that cannot be artfully cut away without loss of the whole. There are biological limits. There are social ties that shape you at the same time as your efforts. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of the cost of solitude and trials, the price being that the path of the artist of character rarely coincides with the path of comfort and recognition. Taking on the role of creator, you also take on the obligation to answer for the results. That means not only working on form, but also keeping humility before the limits set by the body, the past, and the world around. If you set out to shape yourself, do it like a master, with a plan, with patience, and with the understanding that every change both gives strength and imposes responsibility. The practical path of the artist of character goes through small agreements with oneself. Set clear criteria for success, but make them flexible. The goal is not a perfectly static figure, but a living work capable of changing without losing integrity. Track progress as a restorer checks cracks. Regularly assess the effect of habits remaining ready to retouch contours. It is important to distinguish work on form from violence against essence. The former strengthens, the latter breaks. When discipline becomes obsessive, return to the question of meaning. For what are you shaping yourself? Which people around you gain strength from your changes, and which become vulnerable? The ability to accept rejection is not weakness, but a sign of the maturity of a master. Sometimes the best correction is to let part of the project go, to change the direction of the stroke. Remember the human fabric of relationships. Your becoming affects others, and responsibility includes not only personal contribution, but also respect for the boundaries of those close to you. Becoming an artist, do not turn into a tyrant of your creation. Keep compassion, the ability to listen, and the capacity to acknowledge mistakes. Finally, leave room for chance. Art is not only about control, but also about encounter with the unexpected. It enriches form with new meanings. Let character remain a structure that has cavities for light, unexpected shades, and new impulses. Thus, you will create not a statue, but a living being capable of growth, dialogue, and beauty in a world where permanence is rare. And that will be your permanence. A life in which an aesthetic hierarchy of values has taken center stage turns into a well-arranged orchestra of forms and rhythms. Decisions are weighed by harmony and the strength of their impact on the integrity of your personality, not by economic or utilitarian accounting. Such an ordering of values changes everyday life. Choice of work, friends, rituals, and even ways of suffering begin to submit to the criterion of the beauty of strength, intensity of experience, and dignity of action. Here, the outcome is measured not by the sum of benefits, but by the degree to which your capacity to live fully and with style is enhanced. This consequence arises from a deep need to find meaning after the disappearance of former external guarantees of values. The reason is that when sources of total norms lose authority, space remains for the living being itself to rank values. Friedrich Nietzsche held that to evaluate is to create, and in a situation where everyone must create, the aesthetic scale becomes an instrument of responsibility. Evaluation is measured by how much it makes life more purposeful and strong. You choose not by advantage, but by what gives the form of your being strength and clarity. A clarification is needed. By aesthetics is meant not fleeting ornamentation, but a criterion of form and depth. Aesthetic evaluation includes 3 parameters by which you can judge actions and goals: fullness of experience, the capacity to generate new forces, and coherence with the overall style of life. These parameters do not reduce to fashion or an impressive appearance. They require endurance, training of taste, and discipline of attention. Friedrich Nietzsche repeatedly emphasized the idea of taste as an internal judge that gives direction to creation, not merely decorates it. How does this work in practice, translated into concrete provisions? The value system becomes a hierarchy where the upper rungs are occupied by those meanings that strengthen your will, expand the range of action, and improve the quality of existence. Decisions pass through the filter of aesthetics. Will this choice strengthen your ability to answer for yourself, to keep dignity in suffering, and to create new forms of relation? Such a hierarchy acts as a selector that leaves in view what supports growth and casts into shadow what drags down. This arrangement has clear limits and requirements. It presupposes honesty of taste and the ability to keep criteria under the pressure of society, where utilitarian incentives often dominate. Practice of aesthetic judgment is important here. Daily training to notice what makes life more expressive and resilient. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of educating the will through images and rituals. An aesthetic hierarchy requires creating such rituals that form taste and strengthen the ability to choose by form rather than by instant gain. Its link to the broader picture of philosophy is that aesthetic hierarchy is a way to restore meaning in conditions where old foundations have lost power. It offers measures for reevaluating all former norms and sets the task to develop a style of life in which value is measured by the artistic integrity of actions. Being a practical tool, this approach requires from you constant work on taste, readiness to test your judgment, and responsibility for the consequences of your rankings. In Nietzsche's text, this path is marked as the education of a new will, and you can accept it as a method by which aesthetics becomes the criterion of true life force. In one episode, Zarathustra climbs to a height and speaks as if each phrase should change the listener's way of life. The speech there does not inform. It constructs an image
and addresses the will as a material that can be shaped by the word.
Such a prophetic intonation works through several instruments at once. First, aphoristic short formulas form a support for memory. Repetition and rhythm leave a trace in the soul. Second, imagery makes the abstract bodily. Metaphor turns a demand into a trial, a requirement into a practice. Third, address as command and as blessing elevates the listener to the position of a subject who is offered an example to emulate. All this together not only convinces, it offers a model of will that can be tried on and trained. A consequence of this manner of speech is a change in inner discipline. When phrases are reproduced in thought, behavioral options acquire a new form. The old decision begins to seem inadequate compared to the ideal, and the new one more worthy and full of strength. The effect is akin to habit formation. Repetitions and symbols become means of cultivating character. How does prophetic rhetoric cultivate the will in detail? The answer lies in the reworking of motives and goals. The speech sets a task so that its fulfillment requires effort, reflection, and self-checking. The internal conflict between convenience and demand is translated into the field of training. The will is strengthened at the moment of choice, not at the moment of passive consent. This mechanism works because language sets new criteria for self-appraisal. When you move from a particular technique to theory, it becomes clear that prophetic rhetoric is a method of pedagogy of the spirit. Friedrich Nietzsche used it as a way to form not an abstract ideal human, but a concrete type of life activity, readiness for trial, for responsibility for meaning. Speech becomes a tool for educating a new model of the will. It projects norms and offers them as tasks requiring constant checking. The reasons for its effectiveness are simple. Tight form of speech connects the motorics of thinking with imaginal representations. The method structure consists in the cycle of utterance, repetition, ritualization. The consequences are the emergence of stable new practices and the change in moral sensitivity. It is important to hold the limits of application. The power of the method grows with the listener's readiness to accept risk and the labor of inner work. The method's limitations are obvious and important. Prophetic rhetoric requires authenticity of what is spoken and control over the transformation of image into dogma. If words become mere theater without subsequent verification in life, they fix fictive norms and give the appearance of strength where there is none. The effect diminishes with mass consumption of images without practical preparation. Friedrich Nietzsche called for testing, for the solitude of the path, and for constant checking of one's forms. This is precisely the limit beyond which rhetoric loses its formative power. My advice to you is simple. Use language as an instrument for forming the will. Address yourself and others briefly, imaginatively, and demanding. But keep a practice that tests words with deeds. Then prophetic speech will become a technique, not merely a sonic shell of meaning, and the result will be what the author sought when he gave Zarathustra the voice of the educator of new strength. Friedrich Nietzsche led his listeners toward testing the word by action. Attend to that note of responsibility. Let every word become a measure of action. Fix the result and do not allow excuses. Yes, set for yourself small checks, a morning miss and an evening victory. Everything counts and everything teaches.
Do not be afraid to reject an image if it does not serve. Better to change course than to spend years wasting effort. Demandingness without recovery will break you, so a plan of care for body and spirit is mandatory. Don't hurry. Speech demands honesty. Avoid severity for the sake of form. Seek real value and meaning. Check this. In cultivating the will, remember social measure. Do not impose ideals on others. Invite them to testing. Boldly. And remember, the will is a duty. Yes. The rule is simple and strict. Trial and solitude form the necessary environment for genuine growth of the spirit. This is not a theatrical ritual and not a justification of fleeting pride. Trial requires a clear assignment. Solitude requires freedom from others' judgments, and together they form a matrix in which character becomes firmer and more conscious. Friedrich Nietzsche posed this demand as a condition for the transition from words to the dense practical life of the will. Why this is hard and where resistance pulls. Inner tension arises from two sources at once: fear of error and the habit of readily available norms. When you remain alone before a task, doubts appear, and the voice of habit offers retreat in the name of conserving strength. Body and habits protest. Social ties pull you back. The buildup of tension tests not only the strength of will, but the measure of maturity. Will the goal withstand the burden of doubt and solitude, or will it turn into another image that requires no labor? Resolution in practical terms requires discipline that looks simple and mercilessly concrete. Set small trials with clear success criteria and times for checking.
Make periods of solitude regular and protected from external demands. Document results. Recording is honest and does not allow shirking responsibility. It is important to trust these roles because they create feedback, mark the boundaries of progress, and provide material for self-consciousness. Friedrich Nietzsche proposed precisely such a technique: to form new forces through successive, measurable trials, and solitude is appointed so that you can hear your own measure. Cause, structure, consequences in brief. The cause of the desire for trial is the rupture with external support and the need to rely on one's own judgment. The structure of the process consists of a cycle of task setting, its execution under constraints, and objective verification of the result. Consequences manifest in the change of moral feelings and taste. Habitual convictions lose unconditionality, a personal value scale appears, and more often, an internal check acts before external praise. The boundaries of the method are clear. Without regular verification formulas empty out, and without recovery, the body and psyche break. The dangers and tension within trial deserve special attention. Solitude easily turns into isolation when it serves as an escape from responsibility to others, or a refuge from uncomfortable truths. Trial turns into vanity if the criteria are chosen so as to confirm an already accepted self-assessment. These shifts are subtle. They appear gradually and hide behind rigorism and endurance. You need to keep honesty in assessing motivation and readiness to change rules if they lead into self-deception. How to resolve these risks in practice? Introduce mechanisms of external checking, but not by seeking comfort in the crowd. Ask a specific mentor or peer for feedback on a clearly delineated task. Take breaks for recovery at the end of each cycle. Break big trials into series so as not to burn out and so that the outcome is a result of growth, not exhaustion. Friedrich Nietzsche insisted that the path requires both effort and careful regard for strength. Combining training with care for body and spirit is not weakness. It is the duty of long-term will. In conclusion, return to the image of Zarathustra's ascent. Climbing the mountain was not the only action. It was a sign that the trial is accepted as a style of life. Solitude does not cancel responsibility. It cleanses the voice that can then act in the world with greater precision. If you take this rule as a basis, every trial would become an exam of honesty, and solitude a space where character is tested. Friedrich Nietzsche left us this demanding recipe, and its power will manifest only when words become deeds, and deeds withstand the test of time. The path and the mountain serve as different models of meaning. The path measures the length of effort. The mountain fixes the result of the gaze. The path advances step by step and makes you into one who walks. The mountain provides a point from which one can see how the valley is arranged and where losses and gains occurred. Friedrich Nietzsche uses both images as if they complement the same will, the will to the summit and the will to constant movement. The path is the matter of discipline. Each step tests habits. Each morning returns you to the same trial. In this sense, the path shapes the technique of the heart. It demands regular simplicity and honesty with one's own striving. The path makes you timid or steadfast, depending on how many times you choose to rise again. The metaphor is simple and alive. Movement as a craft of character. The mountain is the moment of visibility. Having climbed, you see the network of paths, their interconnections and blind alleys. The summit contains not only satisfaction, but also critical knowledge. Why climb if not for that view of the assembled picture? Friedrich Nietzsche invests the mountain with a duty to assess. It generates the perspective from which subsequent rules and new paths to be conquered originate. How the path and the mountain are linked in the life of practical meaning. The reason for ascent often roots in the desire to understand one's own trajectory. The structure of the process consists in the sequence of choosing a task, persistent work, and revision after reaching the vantage point. The consequences are simple and harsh at once. The view from height gives a basis for reevaluating past steps and choosing new directions. This is a triad that explains why the ascent itself matters as much as the outcome. There is also a symbolic layer, where the mountain is a sign of responsibility. The view from the summit imposes an obligation to speak about what is seen, and the path is the way to earn the right to such expression. In the image of Zarathustra, the ascent to the mountain is the training of a voice that can demand something new of people. Friedrich Nietzsche shows that the strength of the gaze is tied to the honesty of the path. Claims without a traveled road appear empty. This is not philosophical ornamentation. This is a technique of life. If you regard the path as a constant practice and the mountain as a criterion of understanding, you begin to measure success differently. You stop counting the summit as a single act and accept it as a moment of accounting. I propose treating each ascent as an exam. The result is not a point of rest, but a point of responsibility for the next stretch of the path. The fixation is simple. The path makes you. The mountain gives you vision, and from it follows responsibility. Keep the habit of movement. Strive for height for the sake of clarity, and then act, taking into account what you have seen. Friedrich Nietzsche invites living so that every step has meaning, and so that every summit gives a new measure for evaluating the next steps. You choose to go, but you must also choose for which view. And it is also important to remember, summits are deceptive. There are people who, having reached one cliff, mistake it for eternal support and stop walking. Nietzsche warned about getting used to power,
and how easily it can turn into rigidity. True wisdom is to keep the capacity for movement, even when the view seems complete. Every new path requires the courage to doubt former foundations and openness to mistakes that become the material for true mastery. Practical life consists in changing projects, in periodic inventories of goals, and in the readiness to change course if visibility has changed. Moreover, there is a social side. Those who see from height bear the duty to point the way without tyranny. The voice of the summit must be transparent and modest, for true leadership is born from recognizing one's own limitations. Thus is formed an ethics of ascent, not to aggrandize oneself at others' expense and not to demand worship, but to offer a map and help to those still on the way. To view the path and the mountain as a cycle, not as a linear ladder, is to accept that ascent is followed by descent, rest, and a new choice of direction.
Repeat the discipline, check the results, and draw conclusions. Then the summit is not a finale, but a chance for growth. The responsibility of the creator of values is the price for the free creation of meaning. Any act of revaluation requires not only willpower, but also readiness to bear the consequences of choice, which spread beyond personal life and enter the fabric of shared norms. By creating new criteria, you simultaneously take on obligations toward those who will adopt those criteria and toward those who will encounter them. Creating values means a constant decision about what will be encouraged and what will be rejected. Such decisions form habits, institutions, and expectations. When you choose a value, you set the frame for the actions and judgments of others. These frames begin to affect the distribution of opportunities, and which sufferings and joys become legitimate. Therefore, responsibility manifests on two planes: the practical, concrete consequences for people's lives, and the symbolic, influence on notions of dignity, honor, and purpose of existence. I speak of morality as a social instrument, not only as personal virtue. The quality of responsibility is determined by the willingness to subject one's creations to testing and revision. He who rejects feedback risks consolidating the tyranny of moral substitution. One short case. A person proclaims the ideal of heroism, after which a culture forms around them where weakness is punished and help becomes rare. The consequences concern not abstract principles, but real lives and bodies. You may ask where to take criteria for judging the actions of a creator of values if former grounds are lost. The answer lies in a combination of strength and humility. Strength is needed to stand against social pressure and impose a new dimension of meaning. Humility is necessary to acknowledge the limits of one's own perspective and accept corrections from reality. The development of responsibility requires procedures, tests for the applicability of values, episodes of practice, critiques that do not serve destruction, but clarification. Such work turns creativity into a craft, where each rule goes through trials and is altered in dialogue with life. The boundary of responsibility is a moral account that the creator of values may not ignore. Creating new norms entails the duty to assess the suffering caused, to correct mistakes, and to pay for unforeseen damages. Limits manifest in the fact that the autonomy of meaning does not free one from answers before those forced to live by your laws. The freedom of creation is linked to the necessity of restoring justice and making corrections where consequences are harmful. Friedrich Nietzsche emphasizes that the price of autonomy is great. Friedrich Nietzsche offers a concept where willpower and the honesty of the path are tied to the readiness to assume responsibility. In the text, the image of the creator of values is associated with fate-making decisions and with the demand for constant revision of one's own choices. Friedrich Nietzsche insists that the autonomy of meanings is possible only with willingness to pay the moral price, the recognition of one's own guilt,
and active work to repair the harm done. Thus, the creator of values becomes not only a maker, but also a keeper of the consequences he has produced. This duality is a gift and a burden at once. It demands public accountability, institutions to correct mistakes, procedures for verification, and the readiness to acknowledge harm. And this demand is inevitable. It requires the creation of channels of critique, participation of the affected, mechanisms of compensation, and practices that prevent freedom from turning into violence and exclude the dictatorship of new norms. It is a difficult but necessary path. It reminds us that the freedom to create meaning is powerless without discipline. Discipline before one's own product, before the consequence of daily acts, and before historical legacy. The creator must learn to listen to those who suffer in the shadow of his ideas and create paths for their participation in reforming the norms. Justice requires not only declarations, but material steps to restore rights and alleviate suffering. Only the combination of strength, humility, and readiness to make reparations allows ritual and celebration act as techniques for consolidating new meanings. The problem is that an idea alone lives briefly. Words easily disperse. Convictions melt if they do not find support in the body and in shared actions. Without formal repetition and joint performance, the transition from personal discovery to social habit remains accidental and ephemeral. The criterion of a successful ritual can be formulated through several features: regularity of performance, tangibility of actions, symbolic richness of gestures, inclusion of different layers of society, emotional intensity, and the possibility of transmission across generations. Each point is important. Regularity creates expectation. Gestures make meaning bodily. Symbols concentrate complex ideas into simple signs. Participation gives legitimacy. Emotion turns abstraction into experience. Continuity ensures stability. Next, how this works in practice. A repeatable ritual turns a value into a habit. When people gather and perform the same actions, norms are woven into the everyday rhythm. Ritual forms precedents for behavior, creates models of response to crisis, and embeds new meanings in the calendar of life. A celebration can transform a solitary experience into a collective resource, where personal motivation is under the care of shared meaning and shared history. The consequences of such consolidation are manifold. On one hand, stable rituals ensure the transmission of values without constant ideological agitation. They give people a language for pride and ways to experience shared losses and victories. On the other hand, formalization can lead to ossification. Mechanical repetition removes the living meaning and creates a risk of formal observance for the sake of external order. Empty rituals drain trust and provoke cynicism because the external form remains while internal motivation departs. The key question is which rituals are worthy of consolidation. The criterion here is ethical and technological at once. A ritual should enhance the dignity of participants, expand their freedom to act within the new meanings, and at the same time remain open to correction. It must provide for inclusion, not only selection. It must create ways for those who suffer from the consequences of instituted meanings, so that their voice becomes part of ritual practice. Then the ritual performs the function not only of memory, but also of responsibility. The boundary of ritual application is clear and strict. A ritual does not replace moral discussion and is not itself a guarantee of justice. Ritual technique is effective only in combination with institutions that verify, compensate, and correct. Without such mechanisms, a ritual becomes a lid over the problem. It masks pain without eliminating causes. He who designs a celebration of new meanings must think not only of scenography, but also of court, reparations procedure, channels of appeal. The image can help to feel the boundary. A celebration where people keep the memory of victims alive enlivens collective responsibility. A celebration where victims are forgotten for the sake of spectacle turns memory into a commodity. Friedrich Nietzsche emphasized the importance of aesthetics in creating values. He saw in celebration a form of the existence of the will that becomes a habit of the spirit. Friedrich Nietzsche also noted that cults and ritual discipline the forces of the community and direct suffering toward creativity. Therefore, ritual must be understood as a technique of will formation, requiring strict criteria and constant verification. You are responsible for rituals, just as you are for the values themselves. Their forms must be thought through, their consequences predictable, and their procedures responsive. A celebration can consolidate meaning, but it requires skill and honesty in design. Then aesthetics and ritual serve not merely as decoration, but as an instrument that translates an idea into a stable practice of life. This is a story about how to turn a set of bright thoughts into a program for rethinking the human being. What, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, requires embryonic introduction into life? What asks for control? And why this matters today? I take you through the main ideas as through the craft of creating new meanings, where each thought is an instrument, not a dogma.
Revelation acts as a normative because it claims to direct existence and offers a way of life in which a person takes power over himself. The goal of becoming the Overman is considered a creative task. Man becomes the author of his values and forms of being. The death of external supports opens freedom and brings risk. Eternal recurrence serves as a test of readiness to love life as if one had to live it over and over again. Revaluation of values is the destruction of former meanings for the sake of a space in which new ones are created. Self-transcendence requires constant laborious effort of character. The will to power manifests as the driving force of actions and judgments. Compassion is critiqued because blind pity keeps people in dependence. Herd morality shows the dangers of the convenience of mass consent. And the image of the lost man signals cultural apathy. Amor fati turns acceptance of fate into an active practice. Tragedy and suffering become a source of creative force, and truth appears as an act of creation. Self-creation means that character is molded like sculpture. A hierarchy of values gives aesthetic weight to choices. Prophetic rhetoric educates the will. Trial and solitude harden the will. The symbolism of path and mountain helps to see a holistic perspective. The responsibility of the creator of values imposes a moral price on the autonomy of meaning. Celebration and ritual consolidate the results in shared experience. These elements work like a musical score. Individual themes return, change, and are reinforced by the rhythm of common practices. I see philosophy as a technique for transforming human power, where aesthetics and morality fuse into a single work on the self. Ritual becomes the final stage of the process, where an idea is translated into body, habit, and social sign. Without ritual, the pupil remains the keeper of an inner spark. With ritual, the spark becomes a fire that warms others and shapes tradition.
The boundaries and possible distortions of this program deserve attention. Any idea raised to the absolute becomes a tyranny of forms. The desire to increase strength can take the form of domination if mechanisms of responsibility are absent. The transformation of suffering into creativity loses meaning when suffering is romanticized and used for self-assertion on other people's bodies. Ritual becomes a spectacle when it serves the demonstration of power rather than the strengthening of participants' dignity. The idea of overcoming requires constant checking, otherwise it turns into an idea of benefit for a few. These distortions point to the need for institutional architecture, procedures that allow checking consequences, protecting the vulnerable, and correcting mistakes. You will be responsible for choosing the instruments, for the design of practices, and for who is allowed to perform them. I say this without rhetoric. The creativity of values requires skill and honesty, because the result will affect the lives of others. The will to power without control procedures remains empty force. Ritual without compassion becomes a gesture devoid of meaning. An eternal recurrence is useless if it does not inspire concrete actions to improve the world around. Gathering the picture together highlights several supports. First, philosophy functions as a project requiring technique, discipline, and aesthetic taste. Second, freedom without responsibility gives only the illusion of greatness, because every creation of values has a price. Third, ritual and celebration translate individual discoveries into social practices, but they need correction and institutions that accept complaints and make amendments. Fourth, overcoming and the will to power work only when aimed at multiplying life force, not at suppressing others. Fifth, the moral experiment requires experience, time, and honest evaluation of consequences. I end with the thought that Zarathustra's philosophy is an invitation to the craft of life, to work where each morning begins anew and where meaning is tested by deed. If you take up this craft, remember the limits, that ideas come alive through practices, and that the responsibility of the Creator is measured by the fates of those affected by His images.